All right. How are you all doing? February 2018. I cannot believe it. And let's see, I'll see if I can make this quiet over here. Welcome to all of you. And so this is our live Q&A call. So I usually prepare a few slides if you've not attended before, just so that we have something to talk about. But really this is designed for you to ask any questions that you have and for us to just stay connected and to share about what we're doing. So I see a few names of those of you who attended the conference. So nice to see you. And I'm just going to stop my video so it doesn't interfere with the slides. So good morning and all of that. So I thought what I would do for this one, since it's kind of the beginning of the year, is just really quickly go over what I think are the 5 most important things that you need to ask yourself when you go to review an aEEG. So I know some of you are very, very experienced and that this may be a little boring, but by all means, this is a discussion. So please just, if you have something that you'd like to add, you know, I would love to have it. So I always like to keep things super simple and like to keep things super relatable for anybody who is just coming to review aEEG for the very first time. So these are, for me, the 5 questions that you should always be asking yourself when you walk up to the bedside. And these are the things that we're looking for. And of course, there are more things as we get more advanced, but these are the things I think that really help us to decide whether or not the brain is healthy and whether or not the brain is not healthy. And so, and of course, we've got background. So let's just go through these. Background, that's the background pattern activity. So is it what I expect for that baby's age? So if we all, most of you on the call are super experienced. So when we think of background, we're thinking of continuity, right? We're thinking of how continuous is this baby's brain activity. That is really what we want. That is the goal as babies get older, and that is the goal as babies have a healthy brain, is that they have continuous normal activity. So we know that there can be interruptions in that background when babies fall into deep sleep. Right? When they fall into deep sleep, their pattern becomes discontinuous, but this is a normal expected pattern. And then of course, we are looking for this sleep-wake pattern. Is it just one sleep cycle every 5 hours or a day? Or is it happening regularly while they're sleeping? Then we can look for symmetry, especially if we're using a device that gives us more than one channel. We can look at the left and we can look at the right side. Are they in harmony or are they acting up? One of them is suppressed and maybe has an injury, or maybe we have a malfunction. And then of course we have looking for seizures, which we know is always a indication that there may be something unwell with the brain. And of course we know that there are many artifacts that then mimic seizure activity. So we're always investigating the patterns to make sure that we can identify any potential artifacts that might be making us suspicious of something that really isn't going on. So hopefully that makes sense to all of y'all. All right, so let's go through a few examples of how we might look at these things. So I feel like it's important to talk about, since there are so many devices on the market now, is we want to make sure that we're all still talking about aEEG in the same way, and that we are all talking about the 3 most common patterns that have been studied in the newborn. So we are talking about looking at the central and the parietal areas of the brain. So remember, this is limited montage, so we're only looking at certain areas of the brain. And so we can either take the channel from the left, which is the C3P3 channel, or we can do the channel on the right, that's the C4P4 channel. But really the gold standard for background classification, so how continuous is the brain, is still really across that P3 and P4. And that's because of the wonderful Lena Hellstrom-Westis and Linda DeVries and the group from Sweden and from the Netherlands who originally studied aEEG starting in the late 80s, early 90s. They only had a single channel device. And so being able to establish whether or not these patterns related to prognosis and long-term outcomes, that was all they had. And so for decades, that's all they could study and correlate. But then when we got into the early 2000s, we had devices that could be expanded and continue to show aEEG on the other parts of the brain. And so now we have these bilateral readings that we can use. So really, when we talk about the background pattern, we should always be talking about the P3, P4. We can see differences. So when I talked about symmetry, we always see differences between the right and the left when we compare them, but that the margins that we use and the normal values that we expect may be a little bit lower when we look at these bilateral recordings. And that's simply because the electrodes are closer together. So the pattern is going to be a little thinner and a little lower because it's not in the same place, right? It's a different pattern. It's a different channel. So I just want to make sure that people are aware of that. So when you are assessing and documenting and writing in your notes about the background pattern, you should really be reflecting on the P3, P4 or cross cerebral, and really probably cross central is probably fine if you're using that as well, but they correlate pretty well together. So what really that cross cerebral, I'll say that as more of a generic term, cross cerebral should be how we classify our background patterns. And of course, as I mentioned, Lena Hellstrom-Westis, Mona Todt, Linda DeVries, they came up with this classification framework where we call patterns either continuous, discontinuous, or we use some of the pattern names that we borrow from EEG, like burst suppression, low voltage, and inactive. And so I know that most of you are pretty familiar with that. If not, you can review some of the other lectures that we have online that go through this in more detail. So any questions or comments so far from anyone about this? Anything you want to add? These are just some pictures of the actual normal voltage. So remembering that for normal voltage, we always want that upper margin greater than 5 and that lower, or greater than 10, sorry, upper margin greater than 10. And then lower margin is greater than 5. When lower margin is greater than 5, that's when we can say that the pattern is truly continuous. It really is that lower margin, not so much the upper margin, but the lower margin is really that definition of continuity. Greater than 5 on the lower margin equals continuity or continuous normal activity. When that lower margin is less than 5, that's when we call it discontinuous. And then, of course, the other ominous patterns have their own characteristics. But when we're just trying to distinguish between continuous and discontinuous, it's all about the bottom margin. It's all about the bottom margin. That's all that we're really looking at for continuous or discontinuous. Of course, we talked a little bit about sleep-wake cycling. And of course, that pattern that is going between that continuous and discontinuous is a normal variation. And we like that for our babies. And we love to see it happening about once an hour. So this is a pretty ugly tracing in the sense of impedance, right? So we always want our impedance to be low. But in this case here, we can see that the pattern was going along quite nicely above 5 and was continuous. And then it got really ugly. The impedance went off the chart. So this is the impedance down below. So one of the most important things that nurses need to do who manage your aEEG monitors at the bedside is they need to be super tuned into impedance. So they do need to watch EEG and watch the aEEG, but also every nurse needs to be watching impedance. It's so important for us to keep an eye on that. So here with this pattern, very disrupted impedance, then looks like somebody got involved with that, and then the baby probably fell asleep here into the sleep cycle, and then we see it transitioning into a more active pattern, a more continuous pattern, then down into that discontinuous pattern, more continuous pattern, discontinuous pattern. and then continuous. So this is what we call cycling, right, between the sleep and the wake. And we expect to start seeing really nice cycling somewhere around 32, 34 weeks, which I think is funny, right? Everything starts coming together at 32 to 34 week. Sleep-wake cycling is really robust at that point. Suck, swallow, breathe, feeding really starts to turn on 32 to 34 weeks. So everything begins to start organizing in the brain around this time. Let's see, more slides here. Go forward. So we talked also about symmetry. So comparing the left and the right pattern. So again, looking at those bilateral patterns. Again, symmetry between the electrodes is the #1 thing you need to start with. So if someone is placing the electrodes and they place them asymmetrically and they apply them differently, where one pair is very narrow and one pair is very wide, you're going to end up with a pattern that appears asymmetrical, and it's going to drive you crazy and while you're trying to figure out what's going on. So if you have something going on the baby's scalp that requires that you place electrodes more widely on one side, and I would always recommend applying more wide than more narrow. Apply them more wide on the side that has maybe a laceration or a scalp IV or whatever. Apply those first, then do the other side and just match them up so that you have a symmetry in distance between your electrode and symmetry in the area of the brain. And then you'll have a better chance of a symmetrical pattern. And so there are many causes of asymmetry, some of them from the brain itself, and some of them are, and more common is actually problems with the electrodes. So this would be an example of a pattern asymmetry where you see this, extremely flat and dampened left-sided aEEG band. And if we even look at the actual EEG pattern, you see very flat here as well. Very, very flat. And then here's the side we see activity. And so when we look at the actual aEEG that's created, very flat versus lots of activity. And so we're worried about this, but there can be many reasons for this asymmetry. Oops, I guess I didn't put all the reasons in here. So I'll just go through them then. So let's talk about what are some of the more common things. So what are the things that you guys who are on the call, what are things that you see causes of asymmetry that are not brain related, right? Brain related things we know, bleeds and strokes and those kinds of things. But what are the things that you guys encounter that cause this asymmetry? I think one of the most common that I see, scalp edema. Scalp edema is going to cause the electrodes to be further away from the brain. And so the electrodes just can't pick up the brain signal. And so oftentimes you'll see this very dampened pattern for that. I already told you one, right? When the electrodes are too close together on one side and the other side, they're further apart. So we definitely see that. And then, of course, we have issues of things like just dislodgement, electrode dislodgement. So any other things I missed on that one? Experiences that you guys have with asymmetry?
Kefal hematoma?
Yeah, cephalohematoma, yeah, exactly. Yeah, any fluid, right, in the scalp. Sometimes I see a strange asymmetrical pattern when kids are on high frequency. I think I might have a slide of that later that shows kind of like when you move from one side to the other. So it's less of this dampening. It's more actually with the high frequency, it's usually high on one side and then kind of low on the other. But yeah, any fluid in the head. Exactly. And that makes, placement, electrode placement challenging. It makes interpretation challenging. And so I think you just have to acknowledge whether or not, it's reliable and go from there. But, even if you put on a full montage of EEG, that, they're going to still have similar kinds of pickup in those areas because of the fluid. Anything else about symmetry? These are scary patterns when I actually have a couple friends who have diagnosed several strokes, kids who've come in from the newborn nursery with kind of apnea, and they place the aEEG on them. It's just kind of a rule out situation, and it comes back with this very asymmetrical pattern. And they, scan them and find these strokes in these kids. So it's definitely a clue. It definitely correlates when we have these patterns, and it's for a very short period of time. And then after the injury's been there for a while, you may not pick it up anymore. But certainly acutely, you'll pick up this asymmetry, and especially strokes, newborn strokes. Oh, seizures, right? So seizures are very important. Actually, we just had a case when I was in the unit a couple weeks ago where we were all standing around pretty perplexed, this very sick baby on ECMO, and we pulled the full EEG off, and the baby had been on aEEG for about an hour, and we saw this very strange uprising. It was like, oh, great. And on one side only. And we had to go through, and really there was a lot of discussion, like, is this a seizure or is this not a seizure? And to me, I voted seizure. And I voted seizure because it had all of these characteristics. It was spiky. It was rhythmic. It lasted for more than 10 seconds. And it had a very clear crescendo, decrescendo. It had a change in amplitude of the seizure. It had a change in frequency. It had a ramping up. It had a crescendo, and it had a decrescendo. Artifact oftentimes is the same frequency, the same amplitude over and 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 over again. It just takes over the tracing. A seizure is usually superimposed on some of the background activity. So you may still pick up. It can be disrupted a little bit because there's still some background coming through until it really gets to its full power, and then it takes over the tracing, and then it decrescendos out. So I always, in my mind, when I go to look for a seizure and someone says, oh, this looks suspicious, these are the things I'm asking myself. Is it spiky? Is it rhythmic? Does it last more than 10 seconds? Does it have a very clear beginning, middle, and end? That crescendo, decrescendo. Artifacts, very regular, and they come on quick. Think of someone who just starts patting a baby to burp a baby, right? They were feeding the baby, and now all of a sudden they're burping the baby, right? It's like, that patting artifact. Those things are coming on immediately, and then someone stops patting the baby. It's over. That artifact comes and it goes. So let's look at this crescendo, decrescendo. So this is what I mean when I say it has a crescendo, decrescendo. If you look here, it's very clear seizure here. Lasts for about 10 minutes. It has this onset. It goes up, higher voltage. That's the maximum. They've put the marker here so we can see what's actually happening, and we can see this very clear spike wave, spike wave, spike wave, spike wave. But they're not identical. Even though they're very rhythmic, they're not identical. The spacing between them is a little different. Their shapes are very much the same, but they're not identical, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They're each a little bit different in voltage, and they're a little bit different in their frequency. It's a pattern, it's rhythmic, but it's not identical. The other thing about aEEG seizures is that the bandwidth gets really narrow, especially as you get to the top, where you have the voltage is very similar from beat to beat to beat to beat. This very high voltage, it gets very thin, very narrow, and then it calms itself down, and you'll see that it kind of extinguishes slowly, and then it goes away. It doesn't just stop. Artifacts, on the other hand, we know there are lots of causes of them, that they are the bane of our existence in the NICU, our electrical activity that we have. We see so many artifacts. This is an interesting one for anybody who uses hydrogel electrodes still. This was a research study where we were actually hydrating the electrodes every hour. And what was happening is we were actually shorting them out because we were getting the hair and the hat so wet that it was actually basically canceling themselves out. The electrodes were essentially touching. So you can see that it got really flat right when we did the hydration. And these were blinded studies, so the blinded aEEG. So we didn't know it at the time, or maybe we would have done something different. And we were hydrating every hour as part of the protocol. So it would get dampened. Then as the electrode would dry out over the course of the hour, if we come back to whatever the baseline was, you can see it here. And then it would drop down again. And it would drop down, and then it would dry out, and then it would drop down, and it would dry out. So anyways, I think these are funny. Just things you don't know that you're doing when you have a blinded study. Also, electrodes, hydrogels, especially if you're still using hydrogels, they can touch. They get migrated together, especially in high humidity environments. And so you'll see this kind of transient, kind of flattened trace. And then someone is adjusting them here where you see all this tinting, this yellow and this pink, and then it goes back. Miraculously improved, right? So it's just one of those things that if you use hydrogel, you have to keep this in mind if you see this asymmetry that's going on. If you have devices that offer graphs or color tinting, in this particular device, it was yellows and pinks, and you could actually figure out which electrode was actually causing you issues based on which one was, going high and those things. But most of them have either numeric values or have some sort of graphic. But it is, as I mentioned earlier, so important that our bedside team is really paying attention to these impedance, because there's nothing worse than, coming in 3 hours later to review something and an electrode has been malfunctioning. So what are some of the common artifacts? I think number one, muscle. We see this all the time. I see this because people put the electrodes a little too low and they end up getting too close to that mastoid muscle, and you end up picking up all of that, that artifact when babies are sucking or crying. You can pick up muscle artifact when babies are shivering, so there's really not much more to do about that. It's just really fast and fuzzy. So this is usually EMG. And it can cause these uprisings in the aEEG band. But I want to just note here how it, especially this one here that's over on the left, I'm not sure if you're seeing my cursor, I'm hoping you are. You can see how the bottom margin, and it just immediately goes up. And then you can see it is narrow, but the upper margin didn't really shift. So remember that archway, you see the upper and the lower margins both increase. This one, the upper margin kind of stays the same throughout this whole pattern. So, it does dip here a little, but you can see that it has periods where it does come this high. So it doesn't really change the upper margin much. And you can see that it does narrow because that lower margin is narrowing out, but then it just ends, it completely drops out. And this is really an indication of that artifact more than anything brain related. So that kind of square versus archway. We do sometimes see heart rate. This is a very common artifact that we might see, especially if we have a very low voltage pattern. This is a really nice normal pattern with ECG popping through, probably because they're using needle electrodes, which gives a much cleaner tracing. And what happens when you have this heart rate popping through is that the lower margin is a little bit elevated off the bottom edge. So you will sometimes see, because remember how aEEG is created every 15 seconds based on the minimum and maximum voltage, min, max, min, max, min, max. Well, if you have this little bit of heart rate, beep, 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 going through the whole tracing, the lower margin can only go so low because it has this little bit of electrical interference. So it affects the lower margin because it's that low voltage, that time when the brain was quiet, when the brain should have been going into that discontinuous place. There's this little bit of continuous artifact that's being picked up. And so it will shift that bottom margin up, and it usually ends up with what you see here, which instead of that nice usual kind of dipping down where it's that nice round at the bottom, you'll see this more flattened. See how the pattern kind of flattens out instead of rounds out like we would expect typically in that sleep-wake cycling. So over here, you can see how it's a little more rounded. But here, where there's artifact, it's flattened. It flattens it out because it's so continuous. that artifact is so continuous on the bottom margin, shift it up a little. So it usually will kind of throw us off there. Welcome to whoever just joined. I'm just going to mute you just so that I can keep the recording kind of clean here. Let's see if it will let me. Or if you can press mute on your mic, that would be great. Sorry, one sec. All righty. Okay, so let's talk about another artifact. I kind of mentioned it earlier, is this, is high frequency. And that way we can talk about how this definitely, again, similar kind of thing to the heart rate. And you'll have this shifting or drifting of the lower margin. So when we have high frequency, again, this is basically a baby who's been turned, or maybe they just started the AE. They maybe started high frequency. They've changed ventilation strategies. And you have this kind of immediate upper margin drift. And it's because, again, that lower margin is being affected by this continuous artifact. Continuous, 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 continuous. And you see this very flattened baseline. This baby is also very sick brain, right? So we would expect to see a kind of a lower margin, kind of a flatness, but I think it almost fakes you out into kind of a worsened burst suppression pattern, because what happens, that high frequency is just so continuous that it causes a more flat bottom margin than if you see kind of before. So this middle point here, hopefully you can see my little pointer, where you kind of see it jumping up here. Before that, there was more variability. It was still there. Probably there was still high frequency artifact here pushing this, but you had a little more variability. But when this pattern was so interrupted, so you can still see that there's sparsity of high voltage pattern, but it's really hard to characterize where the lower margin is when you have this kind of high frequency. And you can literally count out the hertz on your pattern by looking at the actual high frequency pattern. One of the kind of probably most common artifacts we get is movement. And I always just say it looks like messy scribbles. So just the brain doesn't behave this way. It's usually very round. It's usually very high and off the screen when you look at the actual EEG. But these periods of movement and handling, hopefully the bedside team can document those, but they're just here as well. So I think we'll wrap up there and just kind of, we can talk about documentation another time, but thanks for your participation. Any comments or questions? Again, I just said it's the beginning of the year. Why not just do a nice review of, the 5 things that we want to be looking at when we stand at the monitor, right? We want to always have a plan of attack when we're walking up to review aEEG. We want to say we want to be looking at the background pattern. We want to look for that presence of sleep. We want to look for symmetry between that right and that left. We also want to make sure we're looking for any evidence of seizures, and then trying to distinguish whether or not those suspicious areas of seizure are really, in fact, a seizure with the classic characteristics of that spiky, rhythmic, more than 10 seconds, crescendo, decrescendo, that, change in pattern, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Or is there artifact that's messing up our aEEG, and is there something we can do to clean up this tracing and make it easier for us to interpret it and to make good decisions based on what we see? So it's not always possible to get rid of all these artifacts, but certainly we should at least be aware of them and know that they can contribute to our interpretation. So anyway, so that was our little kind of Monday morning aEEG 2018 review. So any questions or comments or any burning questions for you guys?
Thank you very much. That was really great.
Oh, no problem. My pleasure. And you guys know how to find me, email me, call me, text me, message me if you have any questions in between our calls. you guys are great about reaching out if you have any, crazy tracings you want me to look at. So I love getting emails and all of that. But otherwise, I'll see you guys next month. And I'm traveling to the NEO conference in Munich on the weekend of, March the 23rd and 24th. There's an aEEG workshop happening in Munich. And so I'll be teaching there. So we're going to move I'll be traveling home on the 26th, our normal time. So we'll be doing the March Q&A will be early. It'll be on the 19th of March, but we'll be sending reminders and emails out on Friday like we normally do. So hopefully you will be able to join. And if you're in that area, maybe I'll be seeing you too. So let's see if there's any other questions. Awesome. Thank you all so much and have a great day or great week. I know some of you, it's the end of your day, so thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next month.